If you wake early enough in the royal quarter of the Aranid Palace, before the crows begin their solemn parade across the clouds, and before the kitchen hearths whisper their smoky morning greetings to the sky, you may witness a moment that does not belong to history books, but to something quieter. The prince rises before the palace does, while the marble courtyards still sleep beneath their shroud of morning mist, and the silk drapes in the upper chambers flutter like the soft breath of dreams. Prince Zion walks barefoot through the cool stone corridor that leads to his favorite balcony. He does not speak. He does not summon attendants. He moves with the stillness of someone who knows every step and every sound his feet won't make. There, waiting faithfully at the corner of the balcony, is a small stone table. It is circular, and upon it rests a singular object, a porcelain cup steam curling from its rim in a ghostly spiral, dancing for no one in particular. The tea is always there before him. That is the rule, a rule observed not out of royal obligation, but out of reverence, out of habit, out of something older than memory and warmer than loyalty. This morning the steam smells faintly of jasmine and mint. There's a sharpness beneath it, barely noticeable, but Zion's nostrils catch it nonetheless. Still, he smiles. He sits, and for a long moment he does nothing but watch the sun struggle through the haze of morning. The palace below is still, save for a distant bird fluttering near the kitchens. The scent of stone dew and yesterday's embers hangs gently in the air. He lifts the cup, and then pauses. His fingers, long and elegant, trace the curved handle of the porcelain, like it's a memory. His eyes, deep brown, rimmed with sleepless silver, don't look at the tea. They rest on the horizon, or perhaps beyond it. The ritual is simple. Every morning for 11 years since he turned 21, the prince drinks this tea in silence. It is his one moment alone. No advisors, no military scrolls, no ceremonial robes or court whispers, only steam and sunrise and the soft sighs of a prince who may not entirely wish to be one. But something is different today. Not in the tea, no, it looks as it always has. Golden, calm. Not in the cup. It is the same one he's used for years. The one with the tiny crack near the base, barely visible unless you know where to look. No, the difference is not in the tea. It is in him, because this morning Prince Zion woke with the certainty that he might not survive the week. It was not a dream, nor a vision. There were no omens, no shadows cast long by candlelight. Just a feeling. The sort of feeling that comes from too many glances exchanged behind fans in the banquet hall. The sort of feeling that grows in the silence between his words and his minister's bows. The kind of certainty only those raised in palaces learn to recognize a scent in the air, colder than poison, more bitter than betrayal. Still he lifts the cup and drinks. Slowly, the warmth trickles down his throat. The flavor is perfect, too perfect. Every note in balance, every bitter root softened just enough to charm the tongue. Too perfect. He closes his eyes. If this is the cup that ends me, he thinks at least it is worthy of my last breath. A breeze stirs. Behind him, curtains flutter from the corridor, someone walking, perhaps, or nothing at all. He places the empty cup back on its saucer softly, almost lovingly. Then he whispers, "Not today," not to himself, not to the wind, but to something deeper, quieter. The kind of whisper a man makes to time, or to fate, or perhaps to the ghost that watches over his morning, sipping nothing, saying nothing, merely waiting. Because Prince Zion knows what the others do not. That the morning ritual is no longer merely habit. It has become a test. Each day he drinks, and each day someone somewhere waits to see if it was his last. But he is still here, still breathing, still sipping. And in the quiet triumph of that moment, with the sun now bleeding gold across the balcony floor, Prince Zion begins to smile. Not because he is safe, but because he is ready. There are many kinds of power inside the Aranid Palace. Some are loud, rattling sabers in council chambers, gold coins clinking in velvet pouches, orders barked in the courtyard beneath banners that snapped like thunder in the desert wind. But the most dangerous kind of power in the palace is quiet. It smells of mint and cedar wood. It wafts through steam. It is stirred, not shouted, poured, not proclaimed, sipped, not signed. It is the power of tea. No one knows precisely when the morning tea ritual began in the Aranid line. Some say it was Queen Yasmin, the philosopher queen who first instituted the practice over 200 years ago. She believed that the human spirit needed an anchor to survive the shifting tides of empire. Something consistent, calming, intentional. And so tea, at first it was simple, a warm drink taken at sunrise to clear the mind. But as the generations passed, it grew in ceremony. The vessels became finer bone china from the east, etched glass from the north. The leaves became rarer, the water more carefully sourced. Mountain snowmelt, dew from silver bowls left beneath jasmine vines. Each ruler added a layer to the tradition, until by Prince Zion's time, it was no longer a mere habit, but a performance of inner discipline, a daily act of cultivated serenity. No matter what storms howled through the court, no matter what betrayal brewed or what minister sharpened his smile, too thin the tea remained. Always at dawn, always alone, always the same. And so behind this ritual, an entire hidden structure emerged. First, there was the master infuser, a woman named Nilsa. She was quiet, unmarried, childless. Some said she had once been a desert healer, others that she was a retired alchemist from the southern isles. She wore simple robes and never made eye contact unless spoken to directly. Her hands moved with the gentleness of snowfall and the precision of a surgeon. She selected the leaves by moonlight, storing them in individual lacquered boxes labeled only with numbers. No one but her knew the code. She never used the same blend twice in the same month. Then there was the water bearer, a boy named Rafik, barely 12, but with the eyes of someone far older. His job was to fetch the water from the silver spout that ran through the jade lion's mouth in the palace's east garden. It had to be drawn precisely at the second crescent of the moon, allowed to sit overnight in silence, and then poured at a slow trickle over warm stones before reaching the kettle. Why, no one really knew anymore. But that was the way. Next was the heat keeper, a solemn man named Bahram, who tended to the small coal oven used only for the prince's tea. No flames, no bellows, just steady, glowing heat, fanned with a pheasant feather fan said to belong to Zion's great-grandfather. Everything was part of the ritual. The cup itself, ivory porcelain, slightly translucent. Imported decades ago, from an island that no longer bore the same name. It bore no markings, only a faint crack at its base that had never widened, never faded, like a scar with no pain left in it. And when the tea was ready, when Nilsa had crushed the herbs in her stone mortar, when Bahram had warmed the kettle to the perfect whisper of steam, when Rafiq had poured in silence then, and only then, would the tea be set on the stone table outside the prince's chamber. No one ever knocked. No one ever waited to see him drink, because this ritual was not for show. It was for stillness, the kind of stillness empires are built on. But lately there had been murmurs. The prince had requested more bitter leaves, then sweeter, then no floral blends, then only floral blends. He had once left the tea untouched for 3 days. Another time he asked Nilsa directly what the fourth blend in the green box contained. She had blinked once, answered, then never used that box again. Small changes, quiet ones, but in a palace where silence was often the loudest language, these shifts caused ripples. Some believed Prince Zion had grown paranoid. Others said he had become deeply introspective, seeking spiritual purity. A few suspected something more dangerous, that the ritual itself had been compromised. In the Hall of Copper Echoes, where the servants whispered beneath frescoes of dragon-plumed kings and moon-eyed queens, there were quiet conversations about herbs that numbed the tongue, about powders so fine they could pass undetected through silk, about the old trick of substituting one servant's tea for another, about death that arrived not with screams but with sighs. Still the tea was brewed, still it was poured, still it was set down on that small stone table at the same hour with the same care by the same hands. Because in the Aranid Palace tradition was not just revered, it was protected. And everyone knew if something had changed, if someone had dared to tamper, if the prince truly suspected, then he would not raise an army. He would not shout. He would not send for poisoners or scribes. He would simply drink, or not, and let silence tell the rest of the story. In the Aranid Palace, nothing ever happens all at once. It unfurls like smoke through lattice work, like petals loosening at midnight, like silk unraveling slowly from the hem of an ancient robe. And so too did the rumors. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper behind a carved wooden screen the kind servants leaned against during long idle afternoons when the sun painted the floors with golden slats. 2 kitchen attendants exchanging glances as they scrubbed copper kettles. One said the prince hadn't touched his tea. The other said he did, but too slowly and with too much thought. By the end of the week, the whisper had grown legs. The master infuser. Nilsa passed by the spice corridor one morning and found it abruptly silent. Save for a clove rolling across the stone floor, someone had dropped it in haste, startled by her quiet steps. She didn't speak. She only bent down, picked it up, and placed it gently on the shelf again. But her lips tightened. She had seen this before. The way silence wraps around curiosity like gauze over a blade. The palace was ancient, and like all ancient places, it was alive. The walls had memory, and they listened. There were always 2 kinds of silence in Aranid Palace, the holy kind and the dangerous kind. This was the second. In the southern courtyard, the guards began murmuring about a strange incident 3 nights prior, how the tea tray had been retrieved by mistake and brought back still warm. A nervous apprentice had been scolded quietly, but one guard said he saw the prince smile strangely when the tray returned. Not a smile of amusement, a knowing smile. In the scullery, a new servant, barely 16, asked if it was true that one of the royal cousins had died from an herbal mistake decades ago. No one answered, but someone changed the subject too quickly. In the Falcon Room, where ministers gathered to discuss trade and tariffs, a hawk-eyed treasurer muttered, "When a prince changes his tea, he changes more than flavor." No one laughed. Instead, a court poet offered a verse the next day during a mid-morning reading in the Cypress Pavilion. The cup that trembles in silent hands holds not just warmth, but distant plans. A sip delayed a glance askew. What else might that steam drift through? The poet was applauded, then dismissed early from court the following day. By the end of the second week, the whispers no longer needed an excuse. They floated freely now, like feathers down stairwells, like oil on water. No one knew anything. Everyone knew something. And always the tea remained at the center of it all. What had changed? Nothing and everything. The blends were the same, the scent just as delicate. The cup never cracked anew, the sun still rose, and the prince still drank. But his pause, that long, breathless pause before each sip, was now famous. A kind of unspoken theater, even though no one ever saw it directly. One day, a court painter was summoned to the prince's quarters. He had been asked to design a fresco for the northern wall, a depiction of the four classical virtues: wisdom, temperance, justice, and strength. When he returned from the chamber, pale and silent, the others asked him what the prince had said. He replied, "Only one word: tea." "What about tea?" he said. "Let the fourth virtue hold a cup." The whisper carried quickly. The fresco, when unveiled, showed a noble figure, eyes, downcast lips, serene, cradling a porcelain vessel close to the heart, and beneath it the phrase etched in gold leaf: "Strength lies in what is not spoken." Some laughed at the absurdity. Others stared too long. It was not just the tea they feared, of course. It was what the tea represented. The prince was no longer a boy. At 32, he was unmarried, childless, and despite his charm and learning, had not chosen a successor, nor spoken of alliances. His half-brothers circled each with their own factions, their own reasons to smile too widely or bow too deeply. Some wanted to see him married. Others wanted to see him removed. A few no longer cared which came first. And in this palace where daggers had not been drawn for over 3 reigns, not since the Starfall coup generations past, everyone now remembered why that silence had felt so comforting. Because when violence returns, it does not knock. It comes with a clink of porcelain, a brush of steam against the face, a single solitary sip. The prince, of course, said nothing. His days were as composed as ever. Meetings with the High Council, strolls through the garden, even laughter during the annual poetry recitation from the northern provinces. But the tea became a symbol, a question, a riddle the court could not solve. Some thought the prince had devised this uncertainty deliberately to draw out his enemies. Others believed he was genuinely unsure who to trust, and the ritual had become his only defense, a moment of stillness where he could taste not just tea, but motive. And still others whispered something darker, that he knew, that the poison had already been tasted, that each morning was a coin toss, one the prince accepted with quiet resolve for reasons only he understood. Whatever the truth, the palace no longer drank its morning tea with ease. Ministers sniffed their cups twice. Advisors declined the citrus blends. Even the kitchen began keeping 2 tasters on rotation just in case. And above it all alone in his high chamber, Prince Zion continued his ritual. Unmoved, unhurried, unwavering. One sip, one sunrise, one silent answer to 1,000 unspoken questions. And the walls, always listening, leaned in just a little closer. The quiet corners of the palace are often overlooked. The domed halls and sun-drenched courtyards receive all the praise painted into travelers' descriptions and celebrated by court artists with gold leaf strokes. But the small rooms, those tucked behind hanging tapestries or buried behind layers of red cedar shelves, hold the older truths. One of these rooms lay beneath the North Library, past a passage long believed to be sealed by age. It smelled of dry parchment and time. Dust curled from the floor in clouds when the door creaked open. It had not been touched in years, or so they thought. It was Rafik the water-bearer who discovered the passage by accident. While retrieving a fallen jug beneath a stack of outdated court almanacs, his small hand brushed against a lever disguised as a scroll rod. The wall shifted slightly inward with a soft thud, revealing a narrow stairwell that led to what appeared to be a records room. Inside, shelves of disintegrating jars, old measuring spoons carved from bone, and journals bound in green-stained leather, each labeled only with a year and a single word, infusions. The boy did not linger. He returned to his duties with wide eyes, whispering only to Bahram the Heat Keeper. And Bahram, being a man of slow conclusions and slower speech, waited until the moon was 3 days shy of full before reporting it to Nilsa. Nilsa came that night, alone. She held no torch, only a single beeswax candle in a brass saucer, the light trembling as she descended the forgotten stairs. Her steps made no sound, not out of stealth, but out of reverence, for she knew what this room was. She had heard of it once long ago from her predecessor, a woman called Hamida, who served tea to Zion's grandfather and vanished from court one summer without farewell. The room was real, and it had always been meant to be found only when needed. She passed the dusty shelves, running her fingers along the edges of boxes wrapped in fraying twine. Then, from a crooked stack near the back wall, she retrieved the largest of the journals. It bore the date, year 458, and the title, Volatile Pairings. She did not open it there. She carried it back to her chamber beneath the herbarium and lit 4 small lanterns, one in each corner of the room. Then she unwrapped the leather tie and opened to the first page. To those who bear the weight of warmth, may your hand remain steady and your eyes not fail you in the turning. What followed was not a recipe book, but something closer to a coded confession. The handwriting changed from page to page. Some passages were neat and precise, others frantic and slanted, as if written in haste or by candlelight. The margins were crowded with notes, corrections, tiny drawings of leaves and seeds. It was a chronicle of every substance, harmless or deadly, that had ever touched the cup of a royal. One entry read, cloverleaf and black anise mild tonic when balanced. Induces drowsiness if overbrewed. Induces silence if paired with elder root oil. Another, Jasmine's tears, nickname for unripe starflower. Pleasant aroma numbs the tongue. Used during Queen Sarai's final winter, not recorded officially. And another near the center of the book. The prince requested clarity. We gave him sage and lime blossom. He dreamed of rivers and forgot his name for 2 days. But the passage that Nilsa lingered on was near the back, in ink that had faded to near invisibility. When the mind suspects the tongue becomes its final guard. Root of Kralin, invisible in tea, tasteless in low doses. Kills only when combined with rose vine. Rare, silent, leaves no trace. Effects delayed up to 72 hours. The subject falls asleep and does not rise. Nilsa stared at the page. Kralin root. She had heard of it once, spoken in a riddle at the southern market by a blind seller. The plant that grows beneath silence, blooms with no petals and berries without shovels. She had never seen it. No one had. Because to see it was to know too much. She closed the journal gently and thought of the prince. Thought of the tea blends he had requested recently. The subtle floral shift, the sharper aftertaste. The way his eyes had narrowed when she'd suggested rose petal dust for relaxation. Had he known, or worse, had he not? The journal remained in her chamber that night, and every night after. She made no changes to her blends. She asked no questions. But the following morning, when the dew still lingered on the western leaves, and the coals in Bahram's oven flickered their first breath, Nilsa brewed the tea slower than usual. She crushed the sage more finely. She warmed the porcelain cup a heartbeat longer in her palms. And when she handed the cup to the silent footman who would deliver it to the prince's table, she whispered so softly that even the steam seemed to pause. Forgive me, old ghosts. This one must be clear. The palace woke as it always did. Servants sweeping corridors, scribes gathering scrolls, birds testing their morning songs. But in a quiet chamber above the world, a prince held a cup whose warmth hid more than heat. He sipped slowly. He tasted sage. He waited. And the past, watching from the herbalist's journal below, waited with him. In the heart of the Aranid Palace, where the echo of footsteps becomes a murmur, and the light slants like memory through cut stone lattice, there is a chamber few have entered. It is not large nor lavish. No guards stand beside its doors. No banners hang in boastful symmetry. It is just a room walled with portraits. This is where Prince Zion goes, when he wishes not to be seen, but not to be alone. It is called the Gallery of Lineage. No one speaks in this room. No one dares to. Not even the prince himself. Because those who live on these walls speak enough. There is his great-grandfather, Aram II, known for crushing the hill uprising with a single campaign. His brush-stroked eyes are sharp, calculating. His robes heavy with medals, one hand on the hilt of his ceremonial saber. Next to him, Queen Yasmin, the scholar, cloaked not in jewels but in ink-stained sleeves, and the faint smile of a woman who had won wars without spilling blood. Farther down in darker hues is Prince Hassan the Quiet. No titles, no victories. A ruler whose reign lasted only 4 years. Some say illness, others say tea. Zion often looks at him the longest. Today the room is cold. The sun has barely touched the window ledges, and the incense has long since faded into the stone. Still the prince enters. He carries nothing. No guards follow. He closes the door behind him, and lets the silence settle over his shoulders like a cloak. He walks slowly barefoot, his footsteps nearly swallowed by the ancient rugs laid out like faded tapestries of moss. The portraits line the walls at even intervals, painted over generations, each framed in black wood and glass, their subjects peering down with the calm, expectant gaze of legacy. Zion stops before a new canvas, one painted only last year. His own. The artist, a foreigner from the high mountains, had painted him not in regalia, but in quiet repose. Seated at a low table, hands folded, the steaming cup placed just before him, unlifted. Even here the tea remained. He stares at his own likeness for a long while, wondering not for the first time if the man in the painting looks more certain than the man in the mirror. Perhaps portraits are kinder. Perhaps they lie just enough to preserve dignity. Zion lets out a slow breath. He does not speak, but inside his chest, the words press like soft thunder. Am I the last? It is a question he has never asked aloud. Not to his advisors, not to the council, not even to Nilsa, who if anyone would understand the meaning buried beneath it. Because it is not a question of heirs. It is a question of spirit, of weariness, of legacy measured not in wars won, but in mournings endured with lips sealed and eyes scanning every sip or betrayal. How long had he known? How long had he suspected? He cannot name the moment it changed, only that once long ago he drank tea for comfort. Now he drank for confirmation. Every morning his hand closed around that porcelain handle like a ritual blade. Every morning his tongue read each flavor like scripture, parsing notes of mint, sage, floral, citrus, searching for what did not belong. And every morning that he lived, he wondered whether survival was a victory or a delay. Across from him, Queen Yasmin's painted eyes meet his. He nods very slightly. I have read your journals, he says softly, breaking the silence. His voice does not echo. It lands like dust. I understand now what you meant by silence is the final scholar. She says nothing, of course, but he imagines her smile deepening just slightly. He continues walking, stopping before Hassan the Quiet. This portrait is smaller than the others, hung just slightly lower as though forgotten. A slender man, almost sickly in frame eyes, shadowed with something unspoken. In the painting, his hands are visible, palms upward empty. Zion lowers himself onto the wooden bench beneath the frame. Did they say it was illness, he murmurs? He knows the official records well. Fever, fatigue, sudden collapse. But tucked in the margins of an old ledger, buried in the same journal Nilsa now keeps hidden, was a different theory. Tea, or more precisely, trust. Zion lets his fingers fall into his lap. For a moment, he lets himself rest, not as a prince, not as a ruler, but as a man. He remembers faintly what joy used to feel like. How his father laughed when pouring orange blossom water into his tea for the first time, telling him, "This is how men begin to listen to the world." How his mother always cooled her cup with 2 careful breaths, saying, "The world is too fast. The tea is wiser." And how Zion, only a boy, had once imagined tea was a kind of magic, that each leaf whispered something ancient if you steeped it long enough. Now every sip whispers only risk. Still seated, he closes his eyes. The portraits surround him, generations of rulers, lovers, enemies, philosophers, warriors. And in that stillness, they seem less like paintings and more like memories, watching their descendant try against all odds to remain whole. He speaks once more, barely louder than breath. I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of becoming someone who waits for it. The silence answers gently. A cool breeze slides beneath the door, brushing his feet like a ghost. He rises, walks slowly to the door, and before he leaves, he turns to face his own portrait again. The man in the painting does not smile, does not lift the cup, just watches, just waits. Zion bows his head respectfully to himself, then leaves the room. The silence folds behind him like the turning of a page. Rafik was the youngest person in the Aranid palace, entrusted with proximity to the prince. He did not wear the deep indigo robes of the scribes, nor the brass-banded garb of the inner guards. He had no feathered turban, no scrolls, no dagger. What he had was a pair of quiet hands and the memory of his grandfather's words. When you carry something hot to a man with power, you carry the chance to burn him or save him. Rafik had been delivering the prince's tea every morning for 3 years. He had learned the path by heart, 23 steps through the garden corridor, a left beneath the hanging copper bell, and then the final stretch of polished marble leading to the balcony with the stone table. He was to place the tea precisely centered with the handle turned 2 fingers to the left. Always before first light, always alone. He never saw the prince, but he often imagined him. At first, the job had thrilled him. He was only 9 when he started scrawny, fast, careful. It was an honor, they told him, to be trusted with such a sacred task. But now, at 12, Rafik felt something else. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the not knowing. Not knowing what was in the cup. Not knowing who had touched it last. Not knowing why the prince sometimes left the cup untouched, and other days returned, it empty, the rim kissed, with a faint trace of breath. And worst of all, not knowing if he was helping the prince live or delivering what would end him. No one said it aloud, but he had overheard enough. The whisperings, the nervous pauses between ministers in the colonnade, the sudden hush in the kitchen when Nilsa entered the herb chamber, the way even Bahram, the usually stoic heat-keeper, had begun double-checking the coals before each brew, wiping his brow with a little more force. Last week, Rafik had passed a servant girl in the rose courtyard who had whispered to another, "It'll happen through the tea. I heard the prince knows, but he still drinks it." What choice does he have? That night, Rafik couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling above his small cot in the servants' wing, watching moonlight crawl across the beams like a ghost made of time. What choice do I have, he wondered. He had never asked what was in the tea. It wasn't his place. His job was to carry, to place, to bow and leave before the steam curled too high. But lately, the steam carried strange scents. Last month, a sharp sweetness that reminded him of orange peel but bitter underneath. Then, a week later, something floral, so floral, it made his head swim for a second when he leaned too close. 2 mornings ago, he thought he smelled ash. And that morning, yes, that morning, when he lifted the silver dome from the cup to place it on the table, he swore he felt something cold. Not in temperature, but in feeling. Like the cup itself was waiting, watching. That afternoon, Rafik went to Nilsa. She was seated beneath a flowering fig tree, sorting dried petals into ceramic bowls. Her hands moved with the same grace they always had, but her eyes flicked to him before he even spoke. I smelled something strange in the tea yesterday, he said quietly. She didn't look up. What kind of strange? I don't know. He paused. It smelled like when thunder is about to come, but it hasn't yet. At that she paused. A single petal slipped from her fingers and drifted into her lap. Did you see anything unusual? She asked softly. No, just that. Just the smell. She nodded once, her expression unreadable. Then she said, Good. Your nose is working. Trust it. But don't tell anyone else what it tells you. He wanted to ask more, but he didn't. Because in the Aranid Palace, questions were like arrows once loosed. They could not return to their quiver. That night, he lay awake again. This time he thought not of the tea, but of the prince. He had never spoken to him, never even glimpsed more than a shadow beyond the balcony curtain. But he felt bound to him. Each morning the ritual tied them together in invisible thread. A cup, a pause, a breath. That was all. But sometimes that's all history remembers. He imagined then what it would feel like if one day the prince drank and never rose. Would they say the poison came from the leaves or from the boy who carried them? Would anyone know he hadn't known? Would they care? Rafik sat up in bed. His mouth was dry. The moon was high, and in the hallway outside, he thought he heard someone whisper. He padded silently to the door, peered through the small sliver in the wood. No one was there, only a breeze, but the air felt heavy. He shut the door, lay back down, and whispered to the ceiling. If he dies, do I? The question was not answered, only carried upward into the night, like steam from a porcelain cup. The morning arrived like all others with a hush that blanketed the palace in velvet stillness. No trumpets, no fanfare, only the quiet rhythm of the palace waking itself, a shutter creaking open in the east wing, the faint rustle of a kitchen broom, the yawn of embers as Bahram stoked the coals beneath the copper kettle. And yet, something was different. It wasn't the sky. The pale pink streaks of dawn painted the air just as gently as the day before. It wasn't the temperature. A mild breeze whispered through the curtains, smelling faintly of crushed thyme and sandalwood. But something lived beneath the stillness this time, something unsettled. Rafik felt it the moment he entered the herbarium. The kettle whistled softly, steam rising in delicate spirals. Nilsa stood at her table, measuring the final ingredients for the prince's tea. She didn't look up as Rafik approached, but her hands were slower than usual. Her fingers, always so certain, hovered just a moment too long over the crushed bark before tipping it into the brewing vessel. Rafik said nothing. He accepted the porcelain cup once the tea was ready, placing it carefully beneath the silver dome. His fingers barely touched the metal, but even through it, the warmth felt different. Not colder, not hotter, just different. He walked his usual path through the corridors, 23 steps through the garden passage, past the copper bell, marble underfoot, smooth as river stones. But his heart did not follow its usual rhythm. It beat faster. By the time he reached the balcony, the sun had just begun to crest over the far hills, turning the shadows long and amber. As always, the stone table waited, empty, expectant. He placed the cup, turned the handle, paused, just for a breath, then bowed and left without looking back. Behind him, the curtains swayed. A few moments later, Prince Zion emerged. He moved like a figure carved from patience, measured silent, the embodiment of grace, worn thin by repetition. His robes were simpler today, ivory and ash gray. His hair, usually tied high, hung loose about his shoulders. He sat, looked out toward the pale horizon, and reached for the tea. He lifted the lid, letting the steam rise, inhaled deeply. Jasmine, sage, a hint of bark, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. He lifted the cup, paused, and for the briefest instant, a muscle in his jaw tensed. Just one. Then he took a sip. The warmth slid across his tongue, delicate, smooth. Then a bitterness bloomed at the back of his throat. Not overwhelming, not even sharp, just wrong. A note that didn't belong in the melody. He set the cup down. The sound of porcelain meeting stone was softer than a sigh. He closed his eyes. There had been bitterness before. The occasional bark infusion. The rare experiment with bitter greens to aid digestion or temper sleeplessness. But this was not medicinal. This was intention. He opened his eyes again. The sky had lightened. The palace below had begun to stir. A servant's laugh echoed faintly from the eastern courtyard. The coo of doves from the rooftops. Life continued. But in this small corner of the world, something had shifted. Prince Zion stood. He walked to the edge of the balcony, cup still in hand, and let the steam brush against his face like a veil. Then he whispered without turning, "You tasted it too, didn't you?" He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. Not to the sky, not to the doves, not even to himself. Just to the silence, as if it owed him an answer. Behind him, the curtain moved. He turned slowly. Nilsa stood there. She had not meant to follow. She had not meant to be seen. But something in her had brought her here. A knowing, a guilt, a need. Their eyes met. The prince did not speak at first. He merely raised the cup between them. A gesture of question. She walked closer slowly. Her hands folded before her like a penitent. "I changed the blend," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. Silence. She looked down at the floor. The bitterness. It wasn't poison. I never said it was. It was bark. From the moran tree. He nodded. "Moran," he repeated softly. "The tree that grows in silence. The one with roots that twist inward." She met his gaze again. "I added it because I wanted to see if you would notice." "Why?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I needed to know if you were still listening." He studied her, and something in his eyes shifted. Not anger, not betrayal, but a kind of weary gratitude. "I am always listening," he said. He placed the cup back on the table. "I hear more in silence than I ever did in speech." Nilsa nodded, then bowed deeply. She turned to leave, but before she passed through the curtain, the prince called after her. "Nilsa!" She stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't turn. He simply said, "Tell the others what you learned today." She nodded and disappeared. The prince remained alone. He sat once more, and for the first time in months, perhaps longer, he did not reach again for the cup. He let it cool, let it wait. The tea, like the truth, would keep. And in the stillness that followed, something unspoken passed between the sun and the stone. Not a threat, not a vow, just awareness. And that Zion thought might be the most dangerous thing of all. Weeks before the bitterness bloomed on his tongue, before the footfalls behind the curtain, before the whisper of bark and truth passed between tea and silence, Prince Zion had visited a room that no one remembered existed. The Chamber of Choices. It was not marked on any map, not labeled in any ledger. To reach it, one had to pass through the disused observatory beneath the western tower, where the dust lay thick and the stars had long since stopped listening. Behind a broken astrolabe, there was a door, unpainted, unlocked, unnamed. He did not go there alone. Waiting inside, wrapped in a thick shawl, sitting beside a tiny oil lamp, was a man known only as Afar. Afar had no title, no position. He had once been a court physician, or a royal librarian, or a traveling philosopher. No one seemed to agree. All they knew was that he had been quietly exiled more than a decade ago for reasons too vague to explain, but too uncomfortable to forget. And yet, when the prince called for him, he came. Your Highness Afar said, inclining his head with a gentleness that bordered on sorrow. You found me. I never lost you, Zion replied. Only forgot where I hid you. Afar smiled faintly. Then I take it the silence has become louder. Zion said nothing for a moment, then walked to the low table and sat. There was no tea in this room, only dry air and waiting. I have questions, the prince said quietly, but I don't need answers. I need tools. Afar blinked slowly. Tools for what? To see what's hidden. The old man nodded as if this were the only answer that had ever made sense. He reached into a cloth pouch and drew out 3 objects: a vial of golden liquid, a dried red blossom, and a small, dull pebble the size of a fingernail. These are your choices, he said. Zion raised an eyebrow. Afar explained. The vial is tincture of firevine. Place a single drop in a hot beverage, and if it contains any root-based poison, the surface will ripple. Safe, but unsubtle. The scent may change. Someone will notice. The blossom is sleep flower. If steeped on its own and consumed before bed, it will loosen the tongue in dreams. Those around the dreamer may hear confessions or delusions. The risk is that what is said may not be truth, only fear. And the stone is called a mute token. If worn close to the skin, it dampens a person's capacity to speak freely. No harm, no pain. But the wearer will be unable to speak lies or reveal truths unless absolutely certain. It forces inner clarity. Zion stared at the 3. None were labeled. All were dangerous in different ways. All required trust, he said quietly. Afar nodded. As does T. Zion folded his hands before him. I cannot accuse, he said. Not yet. Not without proof. But something has changed. I feel it with every sip. Do you believe they mean to kill you? Afar asked. I believe they mean to decide whether I live. The old man's eyes did not waver. That he said softly is worse. Zion picked up the vial, held it to the light, watched the golden liquid cling to the glass like reluctant honey. Have you ever used this? He asked. Afar did not answer. Instead, he said, the palace has its own language. It speaks not in words, but in flavors, in glances, in cups half full. When someone changes the tea, they are not just changing the leaves. They are rewriting the sentence before it is spoken. Zion nodded. I need to know who is holding the pen. He placed the vial gently in his robe's inner pocket. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror. For sometimes seeing the truth is more dangerous than speaking it. Afar stood. He walked to the wall and placed his hand on a smooth stone carved with an ancient sigil. The room shifted subtly, light bent, and for a moment Zion saw not the chamber, but all the other rooms it had once been. A sanctuary, a study, a prison. "You are not the first prince to come here," Afar said, voice distant. "But I would prefer to be the last," Zion replied. He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. "What did you do, Afar?" he asked. "To be sent away." Afar smiled. "Nothing," he said. "I only told someone what their tea truly tasted like." Zion held his gaze for a long moment, then bowed not as a ruler to a servant, but as a student to a teacher, and left the chamber behind. Back in his private quarters that evening, the prince opened his robe and removed the vial. It glinted in the candlelight, harmless, almost beautiful. He held it for a long time, then set it beside his bed. He would not use it tonight, but tomorrow he would begin listening more closely, not with his ears, but with his tongue and his patience. There is an old belief among the perfumers of Samara that what the tongue cannot taste, the nose can still betray. It is said that every root, every flower, every crushed seed leaves behind a trace in the air even after it's been boiled, steeped, disguised. A volatile breath that cannot lie, but it can hide unless coaxed out with something equally elusive. Smoke! Prince Zion remembered this belief. He had heard it once long ago while standing in a spice merchant's stall as a child watching a woman in red gloves light strands of dried rosewood above a steaming bowl. If something is wrong with the water, she'd whispered, the smoke will whisper back. He had forgotten that lesson until now. That morning before the ritual, Zion made a change, a subtle one. Instead of beginning his day on the open-air balcony, he asked the servants to prepare the inner solarium, a small octagonal chamber lined with pale marble used mostly in winter. It had no wind, no drifting petals, no birdsong, only still air and tall windows that caught the rising sun like crystal goblets catching wine. He gave no reason, no explanation, just an instruction. "Today, I will take my tea indoors." Nilsa hesitated only briefly before nodding. Rafik brought the cup as always, hands steady but heart fast. The prince was already seated. This time, however, a stick of incense smoldered in a small bronze dish beside him. Not frankincense, not sandalwood, but something older. Bitter cedar soaked in clove oil and wound in dried hibiscus. A rare blend burned not for prayer or perfume, but for clarity. It released a slow gray smoke that curled upward in thick ribbons hanging in the air like silk unraveling in water. Zion waited until Rafik left the room, then removed the silver dome from the tea. The steam rose, the smoke danced, and where they met in the still space just above the rim of the cup, something curious happened. A flicker, a shift in color. The smoke for an instant sharpened, turned slightly greenish-gray, and then resumed its flow. Zion said nothing. He did not lift the cup. Instead, he watched. He waited. And when the smoke curled again above the rim, it faltered in its rhythm. It broke, almost recoiled. Not violently. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for Zion to know. Something had been added, and it did not want to meet the smoke. At that exact moment, Nilsa stood near the herb chamber window, hands still covered in powdered bark. She felt for no reason she could name a tightness in her chest. as if the tea she had brewed had risen from the cup and wrapped itself around her lungs. She looked toward the eastern corridor. No one was there, but the stillness unsettled her, as if something had just been named. Back in the solarium, Zion finally lifted the cup, held it to his lips, paused, then set it down without drinking. He did not need to taste it today. He had already read it, and the sentence it wrote was short. Not yet, but close. He watched the incense burn to the end. Ash gathered in the bronze bowl like snow on a battlefield. When Rafik returned an hour later to collect the cup, the prince was still seated, eyes open, unfocused. The tea remained untouched. Rafik reached for it, then hesitated. Zion turned his gaze toward the boy, and for the first time spoke directly to him. "Tell me, Rafik," he said softly, "what does tea mean to you?" The boy froze. I don't know, Your Highness." Zion smiled faintly. "A fair answer." He gestured toward the cup. "Take that back to Nilsa. Tell her I enjoyed the aroma, but the room was too warm for drinking." "Yes, Your Highness." Rafik bowed, retrieved the tray, and left quickly, his mind racing. Zion remained still. The sun had risen fully now. The marble walls glowed with honeyed light, but in the air, a faint trace of smoke still lingered, and beneath it, a bitterness that had no taste, but could not be denied. That night in his private chamber, Zion removed the golden vial Afar had given him. He held it to the lamplight. Just one drop, he thought, one ripple in the water, but he did not open it. Not yet. The incense had spoken. Now he would wait for the person to speak. And when they did, he would be ready not with rage, not with punishment, but with something far more dangerous. Understanding. There is a room in the west wing of the Aranid Palace that most servants avoid even during the bright hours of day. It's not locked, it's not cursed, it holds no bones, no blood, no whispers of executions past. But it is full of mirrors, and that is often worse. They call it the Hall of Reflections, though, in truth, it is no hall at all, but a modest chamber. Octagonal in shape, narrow as a chapel, its walls paneled with silvered glass from ceiling to floor. Not polished, not perfect, the kind of glass that holds onto shadows just a little too long. No one knows who built the room or why. Some say it was a gift from a foreign queen, an offering of self-knowledge. Others whisper it was used for interrogations, that if you stare long enough into the mirrors, they begin to reveal not just your face, but your secrets. Prince Zayn never asked. He only used it, and only at night. This evening, after the incense test and the untouched tea, after Rafik's careful retreat, and the heavy hush of a day pretending to be ordinary, the prince entered the mirror room barefoot and alone. He wore no robe of office, no rings, just a plain linen shirt, slightly wrinkled from where he'd sat too long in the solarium. He walked to the center of the room, sat cross-legged on the velvet mat, laid across the floor, an heirloom no one had moved in decades. The mirrors surrounded him. 8 of them, each reflecting him slightly differently. One made his shoulders look broader, one dimmed his eyes, another seemed to sharpen the gray in his hair until it looked like frost. But none of them showed the truth. Not really, because the truth of a man does not sit on his skin. It festers behind his choices. Zion gazed at the mirror directly ahead, the one most warped, as if its glass had melted and refrozen mid-confession. And then softly he spoke. If I were to die tomorrow, what would they remember? The room did not answer. But in the mirror, his face seemed to lean just slightly forward, though he had not moved. He tilted his head. Would they speak of how I rule? In another mirror, his reflection turned its head a moment too late. He smiled, not because he was amused, but because he had stopped being surprised. This room always played tricks. It was why he came, to speak without audience, and to listen without being answered. A prince could not ask foolish questions in court, but here he could ask them all. They say the tea is poisoned, he murmured. Perhaps it is. They say I am too quiet, that I delay too long, that I see too much and say too little. Perhaps I do. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me then, how would you rule? The mirror rippled, not physically, but perceptually. The image shimmered, and for an instant, the face looking back was not his. It was sharper, younger, crueler maybe. Eyes that didn't wait. A mouth that didn't second guess. He blinked, and the image returned to normal. Would you strike first? He whispered. Would you call the guards poison? The poisoners. Burn the herbs and break the hands that blended them. His reflection did not blink, nor did he. Zion drew a slow breath, closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the mirror behind him seemed to sigh. He remembered a dream, one he'd had 2 nights earlier. He was in the garden. The fig trees bloomed out of season. A hummingbird spoke to him in a language made of incense. You were meant to be forgotten, the bird had said. You were too gentle for history. When he awoke, he wrote nothing down, because he already knew dreams were never about truth, only readiness, and he had been getting ready for some time. A sound broke his stillness, a quiet creak, just outside the door. He did not turn, did not ask. He only said, if you've come to confess, this is the room. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the soft padding of footsteps entered the room. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Nilsa! She stood near the threshold, not crossing to him, but not leaving either. I brewed the next batch, she said gently. No bark this time, just lemongrass. And honesty. Zion's reflection nodded. So did he. And did you taste it? He asked. I did. Was it bitter? No. He turned to face her reflection in the mirror behind him. She stood still, her hands folded, her posture humble. But her eyes held something fierce. Like someone who had finally stopped looking away from the truth she feared most. You knew the room would show you, she said. Didn't you? Zion stood slowly, walked to stand beside one of the mirrored panels. I didn't come to see what others were doing, he said. I came to see what I would choose when I saw it. Nilsa lowered her gaze. You don't have to forgive me. I'm not here to forgive. Then what? To understand. The mirrors, all 8 of them, now held 2 figures. Zion and Nilsa, suspicion and responsibility, ruler and servant. 2 people bound by the most fragile and fatal of substances. Tea. Zion looked at his own reflection once more, then reached out and touched the surface. It was cold, solid, real. But the ghost that looked back still lingered. He turned to Nilsa. When it's time, he said, you'll pour the last cup. She didn't ask what that meant. She only nodded. And the silence between them was not fear. It was trust rebuilt slowly like a cracked cup reforged with gold. It began as many royal things do, with a polite request. No summoning, no trumpet. Just a folded note placed discreetly on a servant's tray, bearing the prince's seal in wax, and 4 words. A moment, if possible. He sent 8 of them, one for each of the tea servants. From the herb selector to the water bearer, from the leaf grinder to the final pourer. Even the girl who prepared the porcelain. No one knew all 8 names. Zion did, and over the course of 3 days, he spoke with each alone in the small sunlit chamber beside the reading hall. No guards, no scribes, no mention of poison, just questions and tea. The first to come was Seema, the girl who cleaned the porcelain. She was barely 15. Pale from long hours in the steaming chamber, her hands worn smooth from soap and chalk powder. Zion poured her a cup himself. Her fingers trembled as she took it. He did not ask her if she had poisoned anything. He only asked, "Have you ever seen a cup returned with stains?" She blinked. "Never, my lord. And if you did, I'd scrub it twice and mark it." He nodded, then leaned in slightly. "Do you ever wonder who drinks from it?" A pause. "Only when I dry it." That answer made him smile. She was dismissed with a fig sweet and an extra ration token. The second was Bahram the heat keeper. He entered slowly, knees creaking like old floorboards, his thick hands cradling his cap. Zion motioned for him to sit. Bahram refused. "I prefer to stand, Highness." The prince nodded. "I've noticed some days the tea is warmer. Other days, barely warm at all." "Why?" Bahram shrugged almost apologetically. "The coals. Some breathe longer, some die early. I adjust. I watch. Do you ever suspect the fire lies?" The old man chuckled. "Fire doesn't lie, sire, but it forgets." Zion studied him. "And you, I forget nothing." He was dismissed with a bow and a cup of black tea, which he drank without hesitation. The third was Rafik. The boy arrived pale, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Zion didn't speak at first. He merely placed the cup on the table between them. "Sit," he said gently. Rafik obeyed. The prince studied him for a long time, then asked, "Do you know why you're here?" The boy nodded. "Because I carry the cup." "And what does that mean to you?" Rafik swallowed. "That I carry trust." Zion said nothing. Then slowly he lifted the cup and drank from it. A long sip. Steam curled between them like a ghost eavesdropping. When he lowered the cup, he smiled. "Then carry that trust a little longer, Rafik. You're doing well." Rafik left in tears, not of fear, but of release. The fourth was Nilsa. Though she had already stood beside him in the mirror room, she came again when summoned this time as a servant, not a silent confidant. Zion served her a tea she did not brew. "Drink," he said. She did. Then he asked, "How many recipes do you know by heart?" 86. "And how many of them would kill me?" Her answer came without hesitation. 6. His brow lifted. "But only if you wanted to die slowly. And if I wanted to die quickly," she set the cup down. "You'd need someone braver than me." He nodded. "Or more desperate." She said nothing, but the silence said enough. The rest followed. Hamir the grinder, who had calluses shaped like crescents from the pestle he wielded. He spoke little, but when asked if any leaf had changed smell recently, he said, "The sage has grown softer. It never does that on its own." Elia, the leaf selector, who spoke with the confidence of someone who'd cataloged hundreds of textures and tastes. She offered him an unsolicited warning. "If anyone replaced your rose leaf with blood vine, you wouldn't know until the second cup. But by then, you wouldn't need to." Kavi, the water carrier after Rafik, who confessed quietly that he had once swapped the water jar because he thought it smelled off. When asked what he did with the other jar, he said, "I buried it in the garden, just in case." None of them confessed guilt, but none of them were innocent either, not entirely. Because innocence is not merely absence of action, it is absence of knowledge. And each of them knew something. Fragments, whispers, not enough to convict, but enough to understand. After the final servant left, Zion remained in the small chamber alone. The tea before him had long gone cold. He stared at it, lifted it, drank it anyway, then whispered to the empty room. None of them are the blade, but someone is sharpening it. He closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw them all. The grinder, the selector, the pourer, the carrier, the keeper of coals, the woman of roots, each of them part of the ritual, each of them touching the cup before it reached his lips. And perhaps, just perhaps, one of them had tipped the scale. Or none of them had. Perhaps it was someone else entirely. Someone who never touched the cup. Because sometimes the one who poisons the tea is not the one who pours it, but the one who writes the recipe. It was the first public ceremony the prince had called in nearly 2 seasons. Not for a treaty, not for a wedding, not even for a birthday, but for a tasting. The invitations were handwritten, 8 in total, each addressed to a member of the court who held no official title, no land, no political ambition. Former tutors, aging musicians, a retired map maker, people who once mattered in the quiet way that most forget. Along with them, a 9th was sent to Nilsa, and a 10th quietly placed in the hand of Rafik, with only 5 words on the back. Bring the cup. Watch them. The courtyard chosen for the event was the Cypress Hall, shaded and serene with a circular layout that made every movement visible to every guest. Sunlight filtered through the high lattice like golden threads, casting shifting patterns across the floor. At the center stood a single table. Upon it, 10 identical cups of tea, each warm, each steaming faintly, each prepared by a different hand, each marked beneath with an unseen symbol known only to the prince. The guests were seated. Guards stood only at the gate at a distance, and Prince Zayn, robed not in ceremony, but in white linen, stepped forward with the calm of a man not staging a trap, but preparing a truth. Today, he said, voice gentle yet firm, "We taste together." The crowd murmured. He gestured to the table. "Each of you will drink 1 cup, as will I. None of these cups are poisoned, but only one is mine." A pause. He looked directly at Nilsa. She nodded barely. Then, at Rafik. The boy's grip on the serving tray tightened. Zion continued. "If any of you detect bitterness, if you hesitate, if your tongue warns you do not swallow, spit it out. I grant you that permission." No one laughed, because no one thought this was about taste. This was about fear. The first to sip was the old mapmaker Sabir, his hand shaking slightly as he raised the cup. He sipped, paused, nodded. Floral, mild. He smiled faintly. "Jasmine and..." He paused. "Is that tamarind?" Zion gave no answer. The second guest, a woman who once taught Zion poetry, drank quickly. She licked her lips. "Too sweet." "You've grown soft, my prince." Laughter rippled, but thinly. The third, a former palace musician, held the cup too long before sipping. He flinched slightly, bitter, but not wrong. Zion tilted his head, and so it went. Cup after cup, sip after sip. Some smiled, some frowned. One coughed lightly, but no one fell. No one turned pale. No one spat. And then Zion stepped forward. He took the final cup, held it, closed his eyes, and drank. The courtyard held its breath. The steam curled upward like the last note of a forgotten prayer. Then he set the cup down, unshaken, unharmed, unsmiling. He turned to Nilsa and asked, "Which cup was mine?" She stepped forward slowly, studied the table. Her eyes flicked from one handle to the next, searching for the tiny imperfection only she would know. Then she pointed to the sixth cup. Zion smiled. "Correct." He turned to the guests. "None of you drank poison, but all of you drank fear." And then his voice softened. "Do you know what that means?" Silence. He looked down at the table, ran a finger along the rim of the cup still warm from his lips. "It means fear has flavor." Later that evening, back in his private chamber, he examined the guests' cups one by one. Each bore a different blend. Sage, mint, bark, hibiscus, astringent, soothing. A trick of palate, not poison. But what mattered wasn't in the ingredients. It was in the reactions. The musician had flinched. The poet had joked, but avoided eye contact. And Nilsa had known the cup instantly, not because she was guilty, but because she had always known which cup was safest, the one she wouldn't poison. Because trust, like tea, is strongest when steeped by the hand that hesitates. And tomorrow, he would ask her to steep one more. Not all records are meant for others to read. Some are written only to unburden the self, to hold back the weight of unspoken thoughts before they rot into silence. These are the kinds of letters that live folded in drawers, unsent, unsealed, unread. In the Aranid Palace, there was such a drawer, hidden in the lowest corner of a small walnut writing desk, behind a false panel carved with the image of a tiger lily. It was not locked, but no one would think to look there. No one but the prince. Prince Zion opened it only once every few months, and only at night. This night he opened it again. The fire in his chamber had dimmed to coals. The tea on the table had cooled untouched. The tasting ceremony had come and gone, its echoes still gently humming behind his ribs. But what he needed now was not evidence. It was reflection. He pulled out 3 letters, 3 pages of old parchment slightly curled, each folded with care but never sealed. The ink on them had faded to brown in places. The creases were soft from years of being opened and closed. He laid them out, 1, 2, 3, and read. Letter 1, to my father. You ruled with a voice that sounded like thunder and made choices like hammers falling on stone. I do not fault you for that. You were raised in a time when men could not afford to blink. But I have blinked many times, and I have learned more in silence than I ever did in instruction. You taught me that hesitation is weakness. I've learned that hesitation can also be mercy. You taught me that fear must be punished. I have learned that fear must sometimes be endured. If you were here, you'd call me soft. And perhaps you'd be right. But even softness has its shape. And I have learned to hold mine. Zion touched the bottom of the letter. There was no signature, because the man he wrote to would never read it, because he had already buried him with honor and bitterness in equal measure. Letter 2, to someone who was once a friend. There was a time I trusted you with the last sip from my own cup. I remember that. I remember the way we laughed on the garden wall at dusk, tossing pomegranate seeds at the fountain like children too proud to admit we were bored. You stood beside me when I first sat in council. You helped me find words when I had none. You helped me lie well, and better still, you made me believe it wasn't lying. Until one day, I caught your eyes during a banquet, and you looked away. I didn't ask why, but now I wonder, was it guilt or calculation? I hope it was guilt, because if it was calculation, then you stopped being my friend long before I noticed. And if it was guilt, then part of you remembers the boy on the wall with pomegranate-stained hands. And perhaps part of you still mourns him. Zion stared at the crease running down the center of the page. He had almost burned this letter once, but something in him had folded it instead. Because the pain of a friend lost is sharper when the memory remains gentle. Letter 3 to myself. If you are reading this again, it means you still haven't decided. It means you are still drinking slowly, still listening too much, still believing that silence will hand you the truth, like a leaf on the wind. Let me remind you, silence doesn't hand you anything. It forces you to reach for it. You are not being noble by waiting. You are afraid. You do not fear dying. You fear dying without knowing who watched. So what will it take? One more bitter cup, one more flinch in a loyal servant's eye, one more night sitting across from yourself, pretending your reflection holds the answer. Enough. You are the prince, and if you do not act, someone else will act for you, and they will not hesitate. Zion stared at the words for a long time. They felt written by someone braver than he was now, someone whose patience was wearing thin. He folded the letters again slowly, slipped them back into the drawer, but this time he did not close it fully. He left it ajar just slightly, as if permission had been granted. Not to read, but to remember. He stood, crossed the room, stopped at the window. The palace was asleep. Only a few flickering lanterns lit the lower halls. Somewhere a servant walked softly. A dog barked once in the distance and then fell quiet again. Zion raised a hand to the glass. The reflection that met him there was not from the mirror room, but it was no less honest. He looked tired, worn, but beneath the weariness, something stronger was beginning to rise. Not rage, not grief, but a kind of certainty, not yet sharp, but forming like a leaf, steeping in silence. A quiet unraveling, something breaks at last, but not with violence. This chapter brings together the weight of doubt and consequence. The palace awoke to birdsong and breeze. It was early, so early that the sun had only just begun to stretch gold across the mosaic tiles of the eastern courtyard. The marble still held the chill of night, and the lanterns lining the colonnades flickered uncertainly undecided between duty and retreat. But in one chamber, the morning did not unfold gently. A scream short and muffled was heard just after dawn. Not the shriek of violence, but of discovery. The kind that pulls a knot through the air and makes even the seasoned servants pause mid-step. The scream came from Nils's quarters. The master infuser had not appeared at the herbarium that morning. The coals had been lit, the water drawn. Rafiq waited cup in hand, expecting her calm, deliberate presence. But she did not come. And so someone went looking. They found her collapsed near her desk, slumped over her own collection of notes, as if she had fallen asleep mid-formula. but her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, and her pulse, though present, was slow, irregular. By the time Zion arrived, she had been moved to the inner infirmary. A low fire crackled in the corner. A healer stood over her with furrowed brow, whispering to an assistant to fetch boiling mint charcoal and a dish of vinegar. The prince said nothing. He only watched. Her hands were stained faintly with rose powder, her lips dry, and beside her bed, a small wooden tray. On it sat a cup, empty, but not clean. The faintest ring of residue clung to the porcelain's edge. Zion stepped forward. Was it the prince's cup? The healer asked, hesitating. No, Zion replied. She brewed her own blend. The healer exhaled somewhere between relief and new concern. Intentional, he asked carefully. Zion didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't sure yet what it meant. He stared at Nils's face, so peaceful, too peaceful. He remembered the mirror room, the incense, the bark, the shift in her voice when she said, "You'd need someone braver than me." Had she changed her mind? Had she proven her loyalty? Or had she tried to silence her own? Later that day, he returned to her quarters alone. The desk was still cluttered bowls and dried petals, cracked mortar leaves, arranged like chess pieces mid-game. But one thing stood out, an envelope, unsealed, marked only with his name, inside a short letter. I never meant to become suspicious, but I did. Of them, of myself, of you. I watched too closely, listened too carefully, and one morning, I realized I no longer trusted my own hands. That is a dangerous thing in this palace. More dangerous than poison. So I brewed one final cup. Not to end my life, but to prove I still knew what was real. If I live, then so does your trust. If I don't, then something is very wrong in the leaves we've all chosen. Either way, it ends with clarity. Zion folded the note. He did not weep, but his throat closed quietly, like a door pressed shut by wind. In the courtyard that afternoon, ministers whispered. Servants moved too quickly. Scribes dropped scrolls. The taste of the palace had changed, though none had drunk anything. Fear no longer lived in the tea. It had moved into the air. Zion walked the hall alone, robes, brushing against stone like memory. Everyone bowed. No one met his eyes, except Rafik. The boy stood outside the herbarium, empty tray in hand, silent. The prince approached, paused, and asked, "Did she teach you how to brew?" Rafik nodded slowly. She said, "Every cup tells a story, even the ones that lie." Zion nodded, then knelt so that their eyes met. "And can you read them?" The boy hesitated, then said, "Sometimes, but only if I don't rush." The prince smiled faintly. "Then come with me." That night, Zion did not return to the mirror room. He had no need to speak to his reflection, because finally, something had spoken back. Not in riddles, not in rumors, but in consequence. A cup had been drunk, a truth had surfaced. And now, the ritual was no longer about detecting betrayal. It was about honoring those who dared to see it first. For the first time in over a decade, Prince Zion stepped into the herbarium alone. The room, usually warm with the presence of Nils's steady hands and fragrant with freshly crushed leaves, felt strangely hollow. Dust motes floated gently in shafts of morning light. The mortars were aligned. The drying racks were silent. Everything had been left as she always kept it, meticulous, respectful, and exact. But now her absence echoed through the clay pots and parchment scrolls like a voice paused mid-sentence. Zion stood in the center of the room, closed his eyes, and breathed. The smells were still there: lemongrass, mint, bitter root, soft bark. He could almost hear her voice beside him. That one numbs the tongue. This one sharpens memory. That blend, don't use that blend. He opened his eyes, rolled up his sleeves, and began. He didn't call for servants. He didn't send for scribes to document the moment. This was not a ceremony. It was a choice. He moved slowly, reverently, selecting just a few leaves from each jar, grounding them, not with the heavy pestle, but with a smooth, flat stone from the eastern riverbank. Sage for clarity, citrus peel for warmth, hibiscus for memory, and rose leaf not for sweetness but for bitterness. A reminder. He boiled the water himself, not with palace coals, but with an iron pot set over flame wood, just as the old herbalists once did. The flames cracked gently beneath the kettle. The water trembled, then whispered. He poured it into the steeping bowl and let it rest. 1 minute, 2, 3, the room grew quiet. The blend bled color into the water amber with hints of red. When it was ready, he strained it through linen folded precisely and poured it into a cup. Not the prince's usual porcelain vessel. That one he left untouched on the shelf. This cup was different, unglazed, simple, earthen, the kind Nilsa had used in her private blends. He held it in his hands for a long moment, then carried it not to the balcony, not to the solarium, not to the cypress hall, but to the mirror room. The mirrors greeted him without ceremony. He entered barefoot, the cup warm against his palms. He sat on the velvet mat, placed the cup before him, and for the first time in the entire ritual's long history, he spoke aloud before the first sip. This is not a test. This is not a trap. This is mine. His voice filled the mirrored walls, not echoing, not shouting, but threading gently through the reflections. Each mirror returned a slightly different version of him. One looked younger, one more tired, one slightly afraid. He did not look away. He lifted the cup and drank slowly, steadily, until it was empty. And when he set it down, he did not wait for illness or visions or answers. He waited only for stillness, and it came, not from the teeth, but from within. He remained there for a long time, not meditating, not breathing, just being. Later, when he rose, he left the cup in the mirror room, not on the mat, but placed gently in a hollow of the wall where one mirror had cracked generations ago. A scar in the room, now marked with a vessel of peace. In the days that followed, something began to change. No more whispering in the corridors. No more cautious glances when the tea tray passed. No more breath held in the sip, because Zion made the tea himself. Every morning. Sometimes with Rafiq's help, sometimes alone, sometimes with a different recipe. He stopped rotating the servers, stopped using the sealed boxes with numbers. He left the herbarium door open and invited others to watch him speak, not to perform, but to share. And one by one the palace changed. The ministers still schemed. The politics still circled like falcons above me. But the ritual was no longer where fear lived. It had become something else. A space not of suspicion, but of intention. One morning, as the jasmine bloomed early, and the air smelled of dew and dust, Zion stepped onto the balcony with a fresh cup. He set it down, sat, And as the sun rose, he closed his eyes, not in caution, but in calm. And for the first time in many, many mornings, he smiled before sipping. The air smelled of fig leaves and earth. It was neither morning nor evening, but that suspended hour in between, when the sun has not quite decided whether to linger or leave. Shadows stretched gently across the flagstones. Cicadas had fallen quiet. Even the fountains, usually so talkative, murmured more softly than usual. Prince Zayn sat alone by the river's pond at the edge of the lower gardens, far from the balcony where he once tested each cup with narrowed eyes. He had brought no guards, no train, no ceremony, only a cup, simple, unglazed, warm in his hand. Rafik had brewed the tea this time under his guidance, but without supervision. That was the point. Zion took a sip, let the flavor sit on his tongue. Lemongrass, fennel, a touch of clove, and something cooler mint, perhaps, or memory. He closed his eyes, breathed in, not because he feared what the tea might do, but because of what it now represented. It was no longer a test of survival. It was a conversation between leaf and water, between breath and silence, between who he had been and who he had chosen to become. It was not long ago that each sip had felt like a coin toss. Each morning, a ritual of quiet dread. Each cup, a question with no answer. Now the question had changed. Not will I live, but how do I want to live? Not who seeks my death, but who have I allowed too much power over my peace? These were not questions the council could answer, nor the guards, nor even Nilsa, still recovering slowly in the east wing, her breath steadier now, her eyes softer. They were questions for the self, the kind asked not in court, but in quiet, and best answered with steam rising from the rim of a hand-thrown cup. Zion looked across the pond. Lotus flowers drifted like half-forgotten thoughts. One petal fell silently into the water, sending a ripple across the surface, brief, delicate fading. That's what it had always been about, hadn't it? The ripple. A single action, small and unassuming, disturbing the surface of something larger. That was what the tea had become, and why it had frightened them. Because to change the flavor of the prince's tea was to alter the rhythm of the kingdom. It meant reshaping what was expected to remain still. And stillness, Zion had come to learn, is what people fear losing, most especially when they profit from it. A breeze lifted, catching the hem of his robe and carrying the scent of the tea into the garden air. Behind him, the sound of footsteps, soft, measured. He turned, laughing. No tray this time, no cup. Just the boy himself, now taller than the prince remembered. He stood straight, but not stiff. Zion gestured to the stone bench beside him. Rafik sat. They said nothing for a while, only listened. The wind, the pond, the birds waking slowly for their evening songs. Then the prince asked, "Do you remember the first time you brought me tea?" Rafik nodded. I didn't know whether to breathe. Zion smiled. "I remember. You placed the cup and ran so fast, I thought you'd drop it." They both chuckled quietly, then fell silent again, until Rafik said, "I never told you, but I used to pray each time that nothing would happen to you." The prince looked at him, not surprised, just moved. "I know," he said. "You carried that fear well. I carry less of it now." Zion nodded slowly. "As do I." He raised the cup once more, not for caution, not for spectacle, but for a ritual. He took one last sip. Let it sit on his tongue. Let it say what it needed to say. Then he placed the empty cup beside him on the stone. Rafik watched as the prince leaned back, eyes on the darkening sky. You know, Zion murmured, I used to believe peace was something you earned by outlasting danger. And now the boy asked, now I believe peace is something you choose. By no longer tasting every cup like it might be your last. Rafik thought about that, then whispered, but you still check it, don't you? Zion smiled. Only for balance. They sat together until the stars began to blink open in the sky, scattered like forgotten seeds. And in that stillness, soft, complete, there was no fear, no suspicion, just the long exhale of a ritual reimagined, a story rewritten, a leaf that no longer needed to be read for poison, but simply for flavor. And so, in a palace once filled with glances, sharper than daggers and silence thick with threat, a prince found something more powerful than suspicion, trust brewed by hand, not given lightly, not kept easily, but steeped slowly, day after day, until fear faded, and peace remained. They used to say I ruled with too much quiet, that I listened too long, that I hesitated when I should have acted and thought, when I should have punished. They called me soft, then cautious, then dangerous, all before I ever raised my voice. But let me tell you something, only I can say, not as a prince, not as a ruler, but simply as a man who drank his tea each morning, not knowing whether it would be his last. I was never afraid of poison, not truly. What I feared was forgetting how to taste. When the ritual became a shield, I forgot it was once a comfort. When I studied the hands of those who served me, I forgot how to meet their eyes. And when I looked into the mirror each morning and saw suspicion staring back, I stopped recognizing myself. That, more than any bitter root or silent blade, was the real danger. You see, power has a way of turning everything into a threat. Even a cup of tea, even silence, even stillness. I remember the first time I didn't finish a cup. It wasn't because I tasted poison. It was because I no longer trusted my own ability to tell the difference between safety and paranoia. The warmth had become something to survive, not something to enjoy. It took me years to admit that fear had steeped deeper into me than any leaf ever could. And it took a fall, not mine, but hers, for me to wake up. Nilsa, who brewed with such care, collapsed one morning from a cup she made for herself. And in that moment, the entire ritual broke. Not because she died, she didn't, but because I realized the tea was no longer what it used to be. Not a drink, not a symbol, not a sanctuary. It had become a mirror, and I had stopped looking into it honestly. So I changed it, quietly. I brewed it myself. I let others watch. I opened the door. I let a boy steep leaves beside me. And I let my fingers burn from the heat of learning what I should have known long ago. Peace doesn't come from control. It comes from participation, from intention, from tasting again, not with suspicion, but with presence. Every leaf I place now carries meaning, not fear. Every sip reminds me that bitterness can be beautiful too when it's part of the whole. And trust is no longer something I test in others. It's something I practice in myself. Do I still look over my shoulder? Sometimes, do I still listen for footsteps in the dark? Yes, but I no longer drink to survive. I drink to remember that I am not just a ruler of a kingdom. I am a keeper of ritual, a steward of stillness, a witness to every soul who ever dared to place something into my hands, fragile, warm, and full of intention, like a cup, like a story, like a life. So if one day long from now they ask how I ruled, tell them this: he ruled quietly, he ruled slowly, and when the cup came each morning, he drank not because he had to, but because he finally wanted to.